Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Joining me today is Mark Halverson from the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we had you on a few years ago and we talked about Christmas and Christmas tradition. So we're going to do some of that in today's show, I hope, and you brought some things. But before we do that, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
I'm a farm kid. I grew up on a farm outside of Rugby, North Dakota. Norwegian, German-Russian background. Mom's side of the family, good German-Russians. Dad's side, good Norwegians. And grew up in a loving community with lots of kids all around. And Christmas is one of those special times of year which always seem to take forever. I mean, when you're a little kid and going out, doing your evening chores, crunching across the snow, it was a long wait until Christmas, and finally it was here.
Well, now, then explain to us, I guess, your role at the State Historical Society.
I'm a museum curator of collections research. I work with all the three-dimensional objects. We write exhibits. We produce exhibits for not only the main museum, but also the historic sites program and the county, local, and tribal museums that we send out our ties exhibits. We incorporate historic photographs, documents from the archives, then the wonderful wealth of three-dimensional objects ranging from moccasins to toy typewriters to children's toys in exhibits.
Well, as I said, we had you on a few years ago talking about Christmas traditions. But when exactly did Christmas, as we sort of know it today, begin?
In 1840s, Queen Victoria of England was married to Albert. He was a German. He was the first one to popularize and introduce the Christmas tree in English society, because they had a Christmas tree. They had a whole bunch of kids, and they had the houses at Balmoral and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. They popularized in the British tradition the sense of Christmas, and it became more of a festival holiday. In America, the first use of Christmas, and that's image of Santa Claus, comes in at the time of the Civil War. Thomas Nast, who was an artist, he gave us Santa Claus in addition to those familiar things you see, the Republican elephant or the Democratic donkey. But he was the one who popularized Christmas, and that was the 15th of January, 1863, in the heart of the Civil War.
1863. Well, but can you talk about the evolution of Christmas from the origins of, say, Christ's birth, and how it's changed over the 2,000 years?
You have to remember that in the church tradition, in the Christianity tradition, Easter was the grand celebration, the high point of the year. Now, Christmas traditions, some of them are allegedly to date from the time of the winter solstice, those late fall harvest seasons. Remember, the church building on and encompassing all different varieties of people all across the world. Now, St. Nicholas of Antioch was a bishop who was known for his generosity to the poor. Sinterklaas in the Netherlands, different permutations of how you say Sankt Nikolaus in Germany. All these are permutations based on different interpretations of St. Nicholas. A kind, loving bishop, sometimes wearing red, sometimes wearing, because red is the color of a bishop, sometimes wearing blue or green, depending on the tradition, giving gifts during that time leading up to Christmas.
Well, how about in the early years of North Dakota as a territory and then a state? Talk about some of the Christmas traditions on the prairie.
Well, you have to remember, North Dakota has a rich mosaic of people. We have Norwegians, we have Swedes, we have Germans, we have Russians, we have Poles. And each of these groups brought their traditions with them. Now, the common use in Christmas was the Christmas tree in the church. Sometimes they'd have a tree and perhaps a nativity scene or a creche. But for many of the frontier families, it was at an expense they didn't necessarily have initially. In some of the communities, in the towns, they would have it. Eventually, though, by the time of the turn of the century, in the public one-room schools, they were doing some sort of a Christmas pageant or a Christmas play. And the parents would come to listen to their children do a recitation, perhaps do a little play, whether it was a one-room country schoolhouse out in a township near Belfield, North Dakota, or a consolidated school down in southeastern North Dakota. it was those rich traditions with the school children, the Christmas concert, the Christmas play. These were all part of North Dakota's rich tradition.
Well, do you have something you wanted to read for us today?
I'd like to read you a little section from William Clark's journal. William Clark, he's writing on the 25th of December, Christmas, it's a Tuesday. I was awakened before dawn by discharge of 3 platoons from the party and the French. The men merrily disposed, and I give them all a little tafia and permitted a 3-cannon fired at raising our flag. Some men went out to hunt, and the others to dancing, and continued until 9:00 p.m. when the frolic ended. Well, his references to a little tafia is to a ration of brandy, to give them a little Christmas spirit, and also a little additional rations of food. But that's early Christmas in what is now North Dakota. 1805. Remember the Lewis and Clark expedition sent out by President Jefferson, but bringing some of those American traditions, celebration of food and festivity.
Wow.
But what's interesting is New Year's was in the United States was the big official holiday. In 1860s, Philip Regis de Trobriand, who was the commander at Fort Stevenson along the Missouri River, he was lamenting that Christmas Eve they were all snowed in. A huge snowstorm had covered the barracks, but it wasn't until January 1st when there was the traditional calling upon. The officers would call upon him in the morning, and he would call upon the officers and their spouses throughout the day, and the men had the day off. They were issued extra rations, and they were issued a little bit of alcohol.
What are some of the Christmas-related items and artifacts that the Historical Society has for sort of the public to view?
If you go into the museum or any of our branch museums, you'll see everything from stockings to little teddy bears. Dolls were very common. You have to remember that the largest producers of dolls were the Germans until World War I. Those wonderful bisque or china-headed dolls, and when World War I hit, it cut off the entire manufacture of toys and supply of toys to the North American market, and that's when American manufacturers stepped in. But there's wonderful things, games, board games, books, anything that was dealt with Christmas. Usually, though, a child only got one toy. Perhaps it was a doll. Maybe it's a little toy car or a little toy truck, toy tractor. Farm families, a lot of our ancestors came here to farm. Large number of kids, and they loved their children, but they had to be frugal because they had to pay off that farm.
Well, and I understand you've brought some items to sort of share with us today that you could bring here to the studio.
Sure, I brought some things that are more of the educational thing and bring it forward a little bit from a couple years. Now, if you're of a certain age, you remember certain things from your childhood. For example, I think there's a whole bunch of people who remember things like a little Volkswagen minibus, the toy Volkswagen. But it's a classic example of an American toy. In addition, I grew up on a farm, so you had a little toy manure spreader made in the United States. Actually, it's functional. The levers actually work. But this would have been pulled by your toy tractor. Now, this one, of course, is also American-made, die-cast, rubber wheels, and it has the MM for Minneapolis Moline. Now, that's a local manufacturing down in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and to generations of us, we all grew up seeing not only just red or green in the fields, we saw blue, we saw Olivers, there were Cockshuts, there were Case, Alice Chalmers, Minneapolis Moline. If you remember certain things, such as you remember man walking on the moon, you remember whole generations of different types of tractors and toys. In addition, like many of these items, children would sometimes receive things like this, a toy toolkit, complete with your directions and all your toys, your hammer, basically functional tools, a wood plane, a hammer, pliers, screwdriver, all those things that were totally functional. toys have changed over the years. Some things are the same, some things are different. For example, Tinker Toys. Now, Tinker Toys have been around since the 1920s. Your grandfather remembered Tinker Toys. Your dad had Tinker Toys, or maybe an erector set. Now, these are from the 1960s, because if you look at them, you remember this. It has the space rocket and the gantry. Remember, we all grew up in a time, there was a time period where with the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, we had the race to space. We put a man on the moon, and the Kennedy Space Center was part of that. In addition, with your Tinker Toys, you could also make a brand new jetliner. I still remember as a kid going to pick up my sister from the airport, and she came in on a airplane that actually it was a jet airplane, but it had propellers on it yet. But it was, Tinker Toys, a construction tool, very much similar to the modern day K'NEX or the Legos that are still available for kids to play with and are still being popular with younger generations.
Now, one of the things is I noticed, they have a little plastic here, but a lot of these are metal. The tool kit were metal, so things were made a little different back then.
Things were made a little different. The toys were slightly different materials, but they fired those imaginations. I mean, there are generations of architects, civil engineers, who played with Tinker Toys, erector sets, those things that brought life home and fired your imagination. And they still do.
Well, you mentioned too about children maybe getting one toy or one present, but of course in the 1930s, times were tough. So I suppose a child getting a toy was very special.
It was very special. A lot of kids didn't receive things. You have to remember, North Dakota, over 60% of the population was experiencing in the 1930s one form or another of public assistance. But the 1930s also brought us some innovations. Inexpensive American-made dolls. Now, you and your wife, probably right before Christmas, we're going to be decorating your Christmas tree, and you're going to probably be using maybe some large spherical balls, glass, as opposed to some little birds or animals. F.W. Woolworth Company pioneered an inexpensive American-made ornaments, trying to, even in the hardest of times, trying to preserve that American spirit of Christmas, of that celebration at least once a year. Christmas Day parades come about during this time period, kicking off the tradition. In addition, out here on the plains, it was still, something would be done sometimes by the local community, usually in the schools. If you were a child of the 50s and 60s and 70s, you perhaps remember that on a couple Saturdays before Christmas, the local merchants in the biggest town in the county, probably maybe it was Mott or maybe it was Crosby or Rugby, at the local show hall or movie theater, they would show some cartoon and then followed by maybe a silly movie, and afterwards there might actually be a visit from Santa Claus.
Mm-hmm. Well, can you expand some maybe on some of the Christmas traditions, the various ethnic groups, of course, obviously with Germans and Norwegians settling a lot in this area. Can you talk about some of those traditions?
Well, some of the interesting ones, the good folks at NDSU, Tim Kloberdance and Bill Sherman, have been writing about some of the interesting German traditions. For example, there was Santa Claus, but if you were bad, he had an assistant who had a little switch, and if you were a bad child, you might actually get the switch. Coal in your stockings. The Swedish community had the whole festival St. Lucia with the lights and the candles. But I think the one part that it has been brought down to the present day in all these ethnic traditions is the food. At Christmas time, there's still many Norwegian families that eat lutefisk, Sandebakkels, Batagman, lefse. German families, they'll break out the Kuchen, the Pfeffernusse, those spicy cookies and things that they normally didn't have in the rest of their life because working on a farm in a farm family. Also, depending on your tradition, remember, Christmas starts, it's 30 days, starts at Nikolaus, the feast of St. Nicholas, the 6th of December, and goes on through Drei Königen, 3 kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, the 3 wise men. You all remember from the New Testament that on what is now Epiphany, the 3 wise men came bearing gifts, one of frankincense, one of gold, and one of myrrh. Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Now, that's a tradition I grew up in because my cousin was married to a Balthazar Migler. I had Uncle Melchior's, and our neighbor, next door neighbor on the farm, was a Caspar, and his last name was Schneider. So it was like, so those are names that still ring true to these days.
Well, you talked some about the origins, I guess, of Saint Nick and being in the Middle Ages and things. But you've also brought some I guess, some things for us to look at, talking about Saint Nick and Santa Claus.
Santa Claus, right? Now, Santa Claus, you have to remember, this is a classic example. German American, it's a newspaper, that's Christmas edition, from Golden Valley in Mercer County. The classic American Santa Claus, big white beard, big red hat. The Western Union Newspaper Association down in Omaha from 1881 to 1916 was producing, this was boilerplate. A lot of these small town newspapers would produce a Christmas special in which there was the advertising announcing that they had new rakes and perhaps they had some toys, things for the wife, things for the husband for Christmas. There's a whole series of these that are preserved in the State Historical Society. This one is from Golden Valley. There's another one, I believe, right behind there. Now, this is interesting because this one is from Gwinner in Sargent County, and it depicts that sort of European, almost a German or British style community. Santa Claus is on the roof in the foreground. His sleigh is slightly sundered because of the pitch of the roof, but it's a European community, very much a different tradition, but this one is from 1915, the Christmas issue, the Prairie Press. Now, the next one, for those of you viewers from Western North Dakota, you've probably heard of White Earth, North Dakota. This is from the White Earth Record. It's 1916, and you see Santa about to climb down the chimney with his sack full of toys, everything from dolls to little toy drums to little toy horses and animals. Classic American Santa Claus. By the First World War, you know, as Santa evolves over the years too sometimes. In 1917, America was at war in Europe, so Santa Claus here from the Gackler Republican, notice the red, white, and blue ribbons all throughout the holly and ivy, and he's distributing toys to children all over the world. And he's wearing a red, white, and blue, stars and stripes stocking cap. The American Santa Claus as patriotic, Uncle Sam. He'll reach down for the next one, but Santa also was in favor of progress. From the Golden Valley Chronicle, here's Santa driving an automobile, but this is 1908. This one happens to be apparently a Chalmers Detroit, which were also available at the C.W. Moulton firm in Beach, North Dakota that year. But you know, Santa Claus changing with the times. He doesn't always necessarily use a sleigh. And then the next one is a really great one. Most of you aren't familiar with a dirigible, unless you use a term, if you think of the term Zeppelin or the Hindenburg. Well, dirigibles were rigid airships. Well, Santa, in this image from 1911, is using a dirigible. You know, he's suspended below the balloon, and he's distributing children of the world toys. This is from Donnybrook, the Donnybrook Courier, farming community and village of Donnybrook. This was their 11th year of publication, but a classic illustration. And it also shows that importance of the American Santa Claus. Red suit, benevolent face, progressive. And the final image was one from a newspaper in Western North Dakota that they forgot to print on the cover. But it's interesting because Santa, by this point, has progressed even further, and he's flying one of the brand new airplanes. And he's got his toy sack stretched out over the wing, and he's waving good night to all the little sleeping children after he's distributed the toys in the local community. And on the side of the airplane is the expression joy, as in peace and joy.
So very nice. Well, how about the influence of the story, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas?
'Twas the Night Before Christmas is one of those influential stories written by Clement Moore. There has been some scholarly debate whether Clement Moore actually wrote it. The first illustration, of course, by Santa in the United States was Thomas Nast. But by the 1890s, Santa Claus had become the American version. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. This is a reprint that the museum has available in the museum store. It's based on a 1904 Saalfeld edition. This was bought by a young girl in Minot, North Dakota, sold by a printing company up there. With your little indulgence, we all familiar with the opening stanza. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in the hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. But its classic illustration, on one of the last pages, you have all the different types of toys. The elephants, the toy elephants, the ark, everything that was available, everything that brings to life that spirit of Christmas to generations of children, to generations of young and old.
Then can you talk about the influence of, say, another author, Charles Dickens, and A Christmas Carol?
A Christmas Carol is a wonderful story because it comes out of that time period in British history where Christmas is becoming popular. And it's becoming more of a secular holiday as opposed to a religious holiday. And the image of Ebenezer Scrooge and that spirit of not being giving and charitable to your fellow man really strikes British society. Charles Dickens, his works were very influential in shaping Americans' view of shaping the British view of themselves. And every year across North Dakota, across the entire upper Midwest, North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota, Montana, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, someplace, Ebenezer Scrooge is being played by some young person on the stage, because A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens is one of those timeless classics. I mean, if another thing that's a timeless classic that we're all familiar with at Christmas time, you can go to many number of communities and you can listen to performance of Handel's Messiah. It's an oratorio, but they always perform the Christmas section, and they always conclude with the Hallelujah chorus from the Easter section.
And you know, Prairie Region may have something that everybody envies, and that is you usually associate Christmas and snow. What would it be like for you if you had to be in a southern or western state with no snow?
I quite frankly don't know what I'd do, because I've always been around snow. I've always associated Christmas with the sound of crunching snow, having to shovel, and that sort of wonderful feeling that you're sort of snowed in. It's warm, it's cold outside, but that's Christmas. But traditions are different in different parts of the world. I know the Australians, totally opposite us, but Christmas means snow. It means the smell of cooking lefse. It means toys.
Well, can you talk some about the magic of Christmas for children, and how does it differ for adults and children?
Adults and children, I think when you get a certain age, you take more joy out of it is better to give than to receive. I know as a little kid, it was like, wow, I got 3 presents, I got 4 presents, wow. And you reach a certain point in your age and you're going, what you want to see is that expression of joy on your loved one, your spouse, your child, your sister, your brother, because that's what Christmas is. It is that exchange of love and affection in the coldest part of the year with those, to bring them close to you, the ones we love. That's Christmas.
Well, and the magic, as you and I talked about, is there's children of all ages.
There is at that.
Especially when it comes to Christmas. Can you touch briefly on maybe some of the things that are going on at the State Historical Society? A lot of things going on.
A lot of things are going on. The Christmas tree has been up now for a couple of weeks. It'll be coming down here at the New Year. In addition, there's going to be opening in addition to the exhibit, exploring a little more of the early fossil history of North Dakota. And so, there's always things going on at the historical site. Check us out on our website, www.nd.gov/hist. There's not only events going on at the North Dakota Heritage Center, but they're also going on at places like the Williston, the MISIC Confluence Interpretive Center near Williston, North Dakota, the Chateau de Mars in Medora, Fort Abercrombie down in Abercrombie, now down by Fargo, and at the Pembina State Museum, northeastern corner of the state. Check us out and make sure you get out and always remember, at some point at Christmas, there'll be Merry Christmas on the Capitol building, and at New Year's, the year.
All right. Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Well, that's all we have this week. As always, thanks for watching.